Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this live session. Is Islam compatible with Darwinism? Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Now, this particular question, is Islam compatible with Darwinism? This is an interesting question. Firstly, before we go off into trying to answer the question, what we need to do is we need to look into the definition of Islam and the definition of Darwinism. So the first thing to note is, what is Islam? Because the live viewers, there may be some who are non-Muslims, there may be some who are newly practicing Muslims, or they've been Muslim for some years, but sometimes it's good to get a refresher. So the first thing to note is that Islam is a system in which the human being is supposed to be worshipping God, and worshipping God all the time. So it's not just through fasting, praying, giving charity, and the 5 pillars. It is actually every single action that we do is for the worship of God alone. That includes what God tells us in the Quran, what Allah tells us in the Quran, which is to reflect about nature, which is to explore, think, use your cognitive abilities, use these things that God has given us. Even doing these things with the intention of getting closer to God is considered worship in Islam. So for example, one of the early Muslim scholars, and also he was a Quranic scholar, and he was also the first modern scientist. He is credited with coming up with the modern scientific inductive method. So before him, there were the Greeks who were doing the proto of science, and after him is where you really have that point of inflection where you have great scientific achievement. So this is, of course, Hassan ibn Haytham, who is considered the first scientist. Now, Hassan ibn Haytham, he existed 1,000 years ago. So this is way before, Galileo, Kepler, and all the rest. And before him, the Greeks, they were sort of scientists as well, but they weren't really doing things in a very systematic way. So he's the first one to do it in a systematic way. Now, one of the things he says is that he was doing science in order to become closer to Allah, in order to please God, essentially. And that's what a Muslim is supposed to do. Everything we do, whether it's to do with science, whether we're doing science, whether we're doing a job, whatever we're doing things to please God, and we have a clear aim. And that aim is this. What is worship? Worship is that you do something out of love of God, out of hope in God, and out of fear of God. So we have this 3 pillars of worship. Now, what is Darwinism? And how is it distinct to Islam in this regard, in regards to what I just mentioned? Well, Darwinism essentially is the idea that life arose naturalistically. There is no creator, there is no God, it's all a natural process. So automatically, the aspect of Islam that we focus upon nature as a way of getting closer to Allah is automatically gone. And the reason why it's automatically gone is because design that we normally look at to get closer to Allah, design that we normally look at and we think, wow, look at this particular organism, look at the way its colors are, look at the way that it lives, look at the habitat, look how intelligent it is, look at the way it even communicates using its eyes. Automatically that reflection, that love, that worship that we're doing of Allah by looking at his creation, getting closer to Allah by looking at his creation, from a Darwinian perspective, design is an illusion. Design is not really design, it just looks like design. So automatically, there's a difference between the two. And also, when we look at the Darwinian purpose, now Darwinists, atheists, humanists, liberals, whatever name you come up with, they talk about we need to make the world a better place, we need to do science, we need to do philosophy, we need to rationalize, we need to do this, we need to do that. However, from their worldview, the purpose of life is not that. It's not to make the world a better place. It's not to, learn and gain knowledge for the sake of knowledge. No, that's not it. That's what they say, but that's not what the worldview of Darwinism holds. That's kind of like a Muslim saying, you ask a Muslim, what's the purpose of life? And the Muslim's like, purpose of life is to be good to your neighbor, right? Now, a Muslim can say that, but that's not in line with the Islamic faith. Of course, we are good to neighbors, but that's not the very purpose of our existence. A Muslim may say, I believe that the world should be, we should help people be economically stronger, and that's my purpose in life. Again, they've said something which is not contradictory in terms of what Islam says, but that's not the very function of Islam. That's not the very purpose. Likewise, when it comes to Darwinism, the Darwinists who say, oh, we want to make the world a better place, we want to do this, we want to do that doesn't fit in line with Darwinism. Darwinism, at best, what it's there to teach you is this. There is no ultimate meaning to life. There is no ultimate purpose. We only exist for here and now. And as Richard Dawkins says in his book, The Selfish Gene, the ultimate rationale of our existence is the preservation of our genes. So essentially survival and reproduction. That's the ultimate rationale. Everything else is like a byproduct, because we survive and reproduce, therefore we become, the ones who are more likely to be intelligent, we're more likely to survive. So everything else is a spin-off, but that's the core. That's the very, very core. So clearly, those two purposes clash. The Islamic purpose to worship God and the Darwinian purpose, survival and reproduction, they both clash at a fundamental level. Now, that's one way of looking at it, that from an existential point of view, these two clash. These two worldviews, they completely clash. Another point of view is in terms of their claims about the world. So the claim in Islam is that God created all forms of life. Whatever is out there, whatever is yet to be discovered, even if there is something which is very bizarre and no one heard of it, even the early Muslims never heard of it, but we just discovered it here and now in our times, we know as Muslims that that thing, whatever it was created by God. God says in the Quran, He creates that which you do not know, and He is the creator of all things. So if we discover a new species of, say, Homo naledi, some, Denisovans, some rare type of octopus that's extinct now. Whatever we find, whether it's in the sea, the sky, the earth, it's the creation of God, according to the Islamic perspective, and it's been created by God. From a Darwinian perspective, the creation is not done by God, but it's done by this process known as natural selection. And this process basically is, well, you can think of it as a four-step process: variation, inheritance, selection, and time, right? So you have variation in a population, and there are some which are more likely to be adapted to their environment, so they survive, and others which do not survive. So you have this very mechanical process by which life is evolving. Now, in terms of evolution itself, we need to define evolution, because evolution is very confusing, and it's not clearly defined, and that's why we need to be clear what we mean when we speak about evolution. So evolution, as it was known before Darwin, simply means biological change over time, which is theologically not toxic. It doesn't say design is an illusion. It's different to Darwinian evolution, of course. It just means there's biological change over time. So, for example, you have species which gain traits, you have species which drop traits. So you have a particular, say, glass tree frog, which is living in a particular environment, and it has some pit vipers, snakes which are there. So it learns to camouflage itself, so it evolves a new ability. Or you may have a case where fish deep in the ocean, they happen to go under the land surface to an area where there's some caves above them, and they no longer get natural light, they no longer need to use their eyes, and the fish which are not really using their eyes who have the mutations so that their eyes don't work are more likely to survive than the ones whose eyes do work, because using your eyes has a cost. There's an opportunity cost there, there's an energy cost there. So then their eyes, they just lose their eyes, they just have the sockets left, or they just have some vestigial remnants left. So that's the type of evolution as well. That's the type of adaptation of traits being lost rather than being gained. So that evolution is different to Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution is saying all life goes back to one cell. And from that one cell, all of the living organisms and the organisms which are extinct now branch off. So whether it's a blade of grass, it's a hippo, it's Michael Jackson, we all go back to one source. And it says that that particular change from the first cell, some 4 billion years ago, which is supposed to be the date we have right now in terms of the origin of life, not origin of life, when we definitely know that there was life on Earth about 4 billion years ago. So from that point to today, how did this tree branch? They would say it's the mechanism primarily of natural selection working on random mutations or random variations. That mechanical, very mechanical process is of course at odds with what we believe, that there is, I mean, there is ways in which people can reconcile it. I'm not saying that's not entirely possible theistically. But what I'm saying is that the way it's sold as a package is it's a very naturalistic process. It's a process which is completely purposeless, no goal orientation, no design, it's all an illusion. Okay, now, when it comes to a conflict between something in the Quran and something in science, what do we do as Muslims? Now, as Muslims, we are pro-science. We are not anti-science. We believe in, the motto, make science great again. That's our motto, right? We should have hats, make science great again. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that there's a very crude understanding of science which is propagated by atheists especially, I'm pointing out here, which is that science gives us truth, science gives us certainty, science gives us eternal facts, which is not true. In fact, it would kill science if this was the case, because we would be stuck with the science that we had in the 17th century, and because people believed what they had was true, and then no one would be willing to change it. What we mean by make science great again is understand that science is in a constant state of flux. Science is always changing. The way that you derive conclusions, you basically realize over time that your understanding was simplistic, wasn't holistic, and that there was sub-assumptions that you weren't aware of, and that they were false, and then you retweak it and you change it. So science goes through these paradigm shifts. There's a philosopher by the name of Thomas Kuhn. He explains the history of science in this way. He says that if you look at the macro level view of science, you have these periods where you have normal science. Everyone's working within a particular paradigm of science, a particular prevailing theory. And then you start getting anomalies, things that don't make sense. And then you get this resistance to you people who want change. People are like, look, this theory is not really working out. And so you have this revolutionary sort of change happening. And then there's this two paradigms which you can't really compare. And they're fighting, and then one eventually wins. And then revolutionary science, of course they win, but then over time they become normal science, and that becomes the paradigm. Then there's anomalies, and then again. So it's kind of like human history. You have one kingdom that comes, it's in power and it's doing really well, then it declines, and as declining, people are like, we want change, right? We want to get rid of these guys. And then they protest and they do this and they do that, and the leadership is like, no way, we're not letting you challenge our authority. And then these revolutionaries, they get up and they finally overthrow this kingdom, and then they establish their own kingdom, everyone's happy, and these guys are the revolutionaries. And then over time, they become normal again. And then other people start thinking, man, they're doing this wrong, they're doing that wrong, and then the cycle starts again. It's kind of like that in science, according to Thomas Kuhn. So why is that? Why is it that science is always in flux? And why is it that science, we need to make it great again? It's because of the history and the philosophy of science. The history and the philosophy of science teaches us two basic principles. The first principle is that science is not the only route of knowledge. There are many ways of knowing other than just science. Two, science doesn't give you certainty. Science gives you workable models about the world, which are then replaced by other models. Now, truth emerges better from some false model than complete error. So any model is better than not having any, than just having nothing. So science works by doing the best we can with what we have right now in terms of the data. So imagine there's a scientist who he needs to work out what color swans are. So he goes out in the world, observes 1,000 swans, then using that limited set of data, he comes to the general conclusion that all swans are white. So he's gone from the finite to the general. One day he comes across a black swan. And he basically, his theory, his previous theory that all swans are white is challenged. Likewise, in science, you may have a theory that's doing really well for a very long period of time, and then anomalies start coming, and then it gets challenged and replaced. Secondly, we have the problem of, so the first thing I mentioned, which was the black swan problem, is known as the problem of induction, which was first pointed out by David Hume, the 17th century Scottish philosopher. The other issue is the underdetermination of theory by observation. A bit of a mouthful, but what it basically means is this. You have, say, a set of dots on a scatter graph. How can you best make the line of best fit? Well, you can make a straight line, you can make a curve, you can make this, you can make that. So using the limited data that you have, you can make many different inferences. You don't just say, right, this is the only inference, this is the only line that fits the data. Those dots are facts, things that we know, the length of an alligator's tail, the existence of stars, things that we can see, clear data. But the inference is always theoretical. It's always defeasible. So you can make multiple inferences based upon the same data. And it's the case that scientists have to decide, right, this is it. This is the one that we're actually going with. But that doesn't mean it's the only one possible. So that's the second issue. The third issue is what's known as the problem of unconceived alternatives. The problem of unconceived alternatives is this. There may be times where there is a set of data which is in front of you, and say scientists have come to 3 different alternative theories or 3 different alternative explanations, and they've chosen one as being the best. However, it is very much possible that there is in the data a theory that we cannot see because we are limited in our conception, we're limited in what we can conceive. So this is known as the problem of unconceived alternatives. So these 3 issues are enough of a reason to understand that science will never give you certainty. It will always give you workable models which are then falsified. And we have examples throughout the history of science of these 3 issues. Another thing to keep in mind is what's known as an assumption in science, which is methodological naturalism. So methodological naturalism says this. When we are entering this room of science, God, the immaterial mind, the soul, anything, morals existing in the world, anything which is non-physical is discounted as an assumption in science. So, as the evolutionary biologist Scott Todd puts it, even if all the data scientifically pointed towards an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis would be excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. However, he goes on to say a scientist in his personal capacity can believe in something beyond naturalism. So what's Scott Todd basically saying? What he's saying here is this. When you enter the door of science, then you have to put aside everything that is non-naturalistic. You have to explain everything using natural cause and effect. That's an assumption in science. So why we would highlight that is to say that somebody, and people do this, atheists do this, if they say, well, if you look at all the universities around the world, you don't see the scientists talking about God when they're talking about their scientific theories, therefore God doesn't exist. This is actually circular reasoning, because they've mistaken an assumption for a conclusion, right? They actually think that the conclusion is there is no God, when that is the very premise that they began off with, the assumption. So it's completely circular to try and say there is no God because science doesn't talk about God, because that's the very assumption in science. It's a silly thing to do. Although it's a very silly thing to do, it is something which is regularly done by famous atheists. In fact, there's two types of naturalism: philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism. Philosophical naturalism says there is nothing. In science, outside of science, there's nothing. That's atheism. Methodological naturalism, which theists can hold on to when doing science, is just to say, look, while we're doing science, we're just going to not refer to God's creative power agency. These two are two different things. One doesn't lead to the other. Philosophical, actually, no, it is a one-way road. Philosophical naturalism can lead, of course, to methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism doesn't lead to philosophical naturalism necessarily. So that as well is a limitation on science, because it cannot give you those explanations which are theistic in nature. So there may be things which are clearly there to, and they make complete sense from a theistic point of view. But from a science point of view, they'll be like, no, we'll discount that. So we have this very clear understanding of the philosophy and history of science, that science doesn't give you certainty, doesn't give you absolute knowledge, doesn't give you things which are unchangeable and absolute. It gives you information, models about the world, which are replaced by other better models, and this is a continuous cycle forever, right? So if someone says the Quran is wrong because of this thing in science, they're misunderstanding that science doesn't give you that certainty. They don't understand that there could be new information which you can come across in the future which will challenge your previous theory. Okay, so now we're clear about the relationship between science and Islam from that perspective, that science cannot be used to undermine Islam. However, there are a few things which are very important to mention. Science is seen as something which gives us certainty because of a misunderstanding of what science is. The actual definition of science and the philosophy of understanding the method of science is very, very problematic. So we don't have a clear definition of what science is. However, we have a general understanding that you have a hypothesis, you test it against observations and experiments, and you come to a theory which is tested, and then it's peer-reviewed, and then it becomes like a standard thing. The highest level of certainty that science can give you is a theory. However, some people, they say, but fossils exist, stars exist, the shape of the earth, the earth goes around the sun. These things are true, therefore, science is true. So what they're doing here, they're mistaking observations and the level of certainty that we have in observations with scientific theories. This is a fallacy. This is a fallacy known as a fallacy of equivocation. It's like me saying, okay, oh my God, I'm having a heart attack, I'm dying. Is there a doctor in the house? Is there a doctor? And somebody comes forward and they say, I'm a doctor. And I say, can you please help me? And they're like, I have a doctorate in law. What has happened here? I'm asking for a medical doctor, they have a doctorate in law, two different things. So observations themselves are not science. Observations are just observations. You can use the observations of stars to come up with astronomy or astrology, which are two different things. Astronomy is a science, astrology is a pseudoscience, palm reading and all the rest. So you cannot say this thing we know to be true because we have found a fossil. Darwinian evolution is true because we have a fossil, because we have this, because we have that. No, no, no. You're mistaking a observation for the actual theory. These are two different things. Okay. Now, compatibility of Islam and atheism from another perspective I wanted to cover as well. And that perspective was this. Natural selection is the main issue. Natural selection is the main issue when it comes, the problem between Islam and Darwinism, if you were to break it down, of course, is a misrepresentation of Darwin's theory, a misrepresentation of what science can achieve. But fundamentally, the issue is of natural selection. Because imagine you have a bridge. So you have a bridge, you have supports on either end, and then you have a road. So you have people crossing the bridge. Okay. Now this particular bridge, imagine I'm holding, oops, just dropped it. Imagine I'm holding up this bridge like this, right? You have two supports. Now, if one of these supports breaks, either one of them, can you cross the bridge? You can't. It's impossible. Likewise, think of this crossing like a bacteria-like creature turning eventually over millions of years into a massive, much bigger creature, or two genealogies diverging in terms of the tree of life. The history of evolution, Darwinian evolution, which is the tree of life, is intrinsically linked to the mechanism of natural selection working on random mutations. Because if the bridge's foundations are broken, the bridge is going to fall. So if the theory of natural selection, if the idea that natural selection, if it can be shown that natural selection is faulty, it automatically transfers doubt to the tree of life, unless there's an alternative mechanism. Because remember, Darwin's theory is not a theory about similarity. That is similar to this. That's not what the theory is about. The theory is about transformation, how this species can transform into another. Similarities between species was well known way before Darwin, right? It's nothing controversial. Even today, we hear a lot about genetic similarities. Look, similarity between that species and this species. Isn't it amazing? Therefore, they have a common ancestor. No, this is just silly. It's essentially just plain silly. Your genotype and your phenotype, like your actual physical, the way that you look, these are of course linked. Your genes lead to that. So if something looks physically similar to something else, like a human and a chimpanzee, then of course, genetically, they're also going to be similar because they have the same sort of anatomy. So it's not at all surprising that you have similarities genetically. We have similarities anatomically. That's a, it's a dead end. It's not an argument. The only way you give that argument, because remember, homology is the assumption that similarities is due to common descent. That's an assumption. The way that you lift up that assumption and you try and take it off the ground is by showing a mechanism. And at the moment, the mechanism of natural selection. Now we're coming to the half an hour mark, which is usually the time. I think it's the time to sort of end the session and take Q&A. So I want to mention one last point. So we have natural selection as the mechanism. For the last 150 years, natural selection has been taught like an indisputable fact. Even recently, I was watching a documentary on, I'm not going to say the TV channel, could cause issues. And it had the TV presenter who was talking about the history of the earth, and they said, yep, life evolved by natural selection. That's just like a given. It's just like saying, that Mongolia is a real country and exists, right? Yeah. Well, evolution by natural selection, that's how we came here. I mean, it's so off the cuff. It's just like, oh yeah, come on guys, like, no worth arguing about. However, it is worth arguing about. So evolution by natural selection, Darwinian evolution, this was taught as a fact for the last 150 years in textbooks, schools, documentaries, popular science writers, books, newspapers, social media, celebrities, you name it. However, in 2016, a very interesting thing happened. biologists from different parts of the world, they came together to meet at the Royal Society in London, which is the original place where Darwin proposed his theory, which is the oldest society in the world, the most prestigious science society in the world. And the fundamental question that they had in front of them is Darwin's theory right? And there were some scientists who were saying, no, we need an alternative. There's some who were saying yes. Now, in this short webinar, we cannot go into the details of why this camp said yes and this camp said no. Now, the vast majority of biologists, they still subscribe to it. However, isn't it interesting that a theory we've been told is indisputable, eternal, fact, undeniable, biologists in 2016, 150 years after Darwin, they actually talking about his very core and saying, was Darwin even right? It just goes to show you the massive difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. Now, why is this massive difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding? Is it just a misunderstanding because the public is misinformed? No, it's something more than that. It's the fact that Darwinism, according to mainstream evolutionary biologists and philosophers of science who are pro-Darwin and anti-Darwin, Darwinian evolution is not just a valid scientific theory, which is what it is. Remember, saying a valid scientific theory doesn't mean that you're saying it's true. However, being a valid scientific theory as it is did not stop it from also morphing into a naturalistic religion. Now, initially when you hear Darwin's theory, religion, no, that's just a false attack on the theory. We're not attacking the scientific theory here. We're talking about how the theory morphed into something way beyond the theory. It morphed into a ideology, into a religion. So there are a few people who have openly spoken about this. Secular mainstream academics who are atheists have spoken about this. There's a book published by Oxford University in 2016 called Darwinism as Religion. Remember, this is Oxford University publishing a book, and the writer of the book is none other than Michael Ruse, who is the most prolific writer on Darwinism, and he himself is a Darwinist and an atheist. But he admits in that book, Darwinism as Religion, that Darwin's theory is a valid scientific theory, but it also has another thing above it, which is also an alternative to mainstream religions. It's a secular religion. Julian Huxley, before him, a very famous evolutionary biologist and philosopher, atheist philosopher, he argued in his book Religion Without Revelation, which I think was published in 1927, that religion without revelation, so there you go, you got the first clue. So there's a religion without God. He said this religion is evolutionary humanism, and he argued that we need to evangelize the world. We need to bring them towards this religion. So that's the reason why there's a massive difference between the public and the academic understanding. It's not just a simple mistake. Okay, so Islam and Darwinism, are they compatible? From a religion point of view, of course not. But from a point of view that this is a valid science and this is Islam, you know, a Muslim can accept it as a valid science, work within that field, contribute to that field, you know, not a problem. You can do that. But from an ideological perspective, they clash. And we can challenge that by pointing out it's not just a scientific theory, it's also a religion, and also pointing out that, look, at best, it's still based on a probabilistic framework, which has assumptions, and there's disputes, core disputes about its main ideas, and science will never give you that level of certainty anyway. The purpose of life in Islam, to worship God, to love God, fear God, have hope in God, is not undermined, and nor is design an illusion because of Darwin's theory. Everything good I've said is from Allah, every mistake is my own. Jazakallah khair for listening. And you can type your questions in there, and I will take maybe 5 to 10 minutes and answer the questions. So let's see if there were any questions. So far, no questions. Okay, that's not bad actually. Usually what happens with these sort of videos is there's a lot more people watching this after it's published, and then they're like, oh no, I should have asked the question. So let me go over maybe some of the usual questions I do get. So one of the usual questions I do get is, what do we read? What do we have? So we are publishing a book called Failed Hypothesis, which is long overdue. But inshallah, early 2020 it will be published, with the permission of Allah. This book will be written by Hamza Sources and myself, and also another academic. And this book will cover Darwinism, the science, evolutionary science, consciousness, new atheism, philosophy of science, fitra, loads of different topics, essays on these topics. So that's a really good book to look out for. Another popular question is about, let's see. Oh yes, I have a channel called Darwinian Delusions. That's not the usual question I get, but it's a good time to make a plug. Why not? No one's stopping me. So Darwinian Delusions is my YouTube channel. I regularly make videos against Darwin's theory, and you can ask questions there about it as well. Other than that, what other sort of questions do I get? Well, there's a link. You get a question about Darwin and God, Darwinism and God. So although Darwinism today has become synonymous with atheism, and it's linked. It's like how should we say it? The link between India and Hinduism is the same link which is supposedly between atheism and Darwinism. It's almost like Darwinism is the land and atheism is the belief, and just like Hinduism is the religion and India is the land. However, Darwin himself was never an atheist. He, in fact, said that in my wildest fluctuations, I was never an atheist. When he published The Origin of Species, he was not an atheist. He was a deist, believed in God, but didn't believe God intervened in the world. He didn't believe his theory was atheistic. And I think if he was alive today, he would have disagreed with the likes of Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, all these guys. He would have said, look, you guys are misusing my theory. The theory does not undermine God. And definitely, in The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins argues that, his central argument against God is based upon design being an illusion. Basically, Darwinism has taught us that in biology there's no design, so there may be some Darwinian explanation for the universe itself. So, it's a really silly argument, because Richard Dawkins seems to, and he does clearly say, Darwinism allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists. Well, Darwin would have disagreed with him completely, because he himself was never an intellectually satisfied atheist. So do you understand his theory better than him? Because clearly you're not coming to the same conclusions as he are, and supposedly he understands more than you. So you either misunderstand the theory or you know more than him. So you've got to decide between the two. Let's see if there's any other questions. No questions. Okay, no problem. Jazakallah khair for listening. Everything good I have said is from Allah. Every mistake is my own. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant wa nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.